It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and John Daigle.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast. We are, of course, presented by DraftKings. Love this show. Primarily because my guy John Daigle has so much information that's very helpful for me, whether I'm calling games or just wrapping my head around the week that will be in the NFL. Love taking notes while John is talking. Encourage you to do the same. You can, of course, always check us out on social media. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL, the former offensive lineman. I do have an NFL game this week on CBS. It'll be the Ravens and the Browns. Looking forward to getting some notes from John on that one. He is at NotJDaigle. Of course, remember, they got the best site going right now. It's EstablishTheRun.com. It's Evan Silva. It's Adam Levitan. It's John Daigle. It's more than just fantasy information, but really any info you're looking for to have a better grasp of the NFL, just go to EstablishTheRun.com and see their free content. I'm pretty sure when you see that, you're going to upgrade using the code FEAST. You get a discount. Make sure you use the code FEAST. You can check us out on social at Ross Tucker Pod. And all these shows, youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL. John, let's start with Thursday night. It's a juicy matchup this week. I feel like from a fantasy perspective, Vikings-Rams, sounds like the Rams are getting Cooper Kupp back, but also sounds like he's on the trade market. This whole thing is fascinating.
Lots of moving pieces in the NFL over the next couple of weeks before the trade deadline. And it does start with, as you said, a fun one. Also because this is the first time Sean McVay and Kevin O'Connell have had a chance to play each other ever since O'Connell left the Rams for the Vikings. And it's going to be interesting on defense in particular and how Brian Flores reaches Stafford, because we've seen the last couple of years as Stafford has gotten a little bit older, like all of us, it all comes down to if he's under pressure. Can you reach him behind that Rams O-line? Because if you can, the Rams offense has crumbled. Stafford this year under pressure, 25th in completion rate, 3 interceptions, no touchdowns. And we know Flores is going to send the house. I think the good news is, regardless of whether Flores can reach Stafford, is that the Vikings are one of only 3 defenses allowing over 15 points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. So if Cooper Kupp is back in this game, especially without Puka Nacua, we know he's just going to get hammered targets once again. And so Kupp, if he's available, you're jamming him right back in to your fantasy lineups as a wide receiver 1. Kyren Williams got there last week against the Raiders front 7 that everyone gets there, a couple of touchdowns. It was also very overblown about how Blake Corum, the explosive rookie, was going to cut into his timeshare out of the bye. Just 3 touches for Corum compared to 21 for Kyren Williams. So we continue to trust those players. On the other side of the ball for the Vikings is where I have questions as well. And I think it's because I personally am still skeptical about the Rams and what they've done on defense. Before their bye, remember, a couple of shakeups. Darius Williams got him back in the secondary, which is a very important piece, especially at cornerback, where they were already lacking a lot of talent. And they benched Tre'Davious White altogether because he just wasn't pulling his weight in that area of the field. But it also, Jordan Love, although he didn't really have a ceiling game before their bye, it was still over 8.5 yards per attempt. And then we didn't even really get a chance to see that Rams secondary tested this past week against Aiden O'Connell, who got injured in the first quarter, and then Gardner Minshew, who has pretty much lost all the mojo since he's been benched in the last couple of weeks. 5 interceptions now the last 2 games. So I do think it's a game where I'm curious to see if Sam Darnold and Aaron Jones, if they can test this secondary, because if so, it's one we still want to attack for fantasy with Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and as I mentioned, Aaron Jones, who even coming out of the bye with a hip injury, 17 touches to Ty Chandler's 2. He still remains a top 12 running back, getting every single opportunity in that backfield.
Let's go to Baltimore, Cleveland. I'll be there in the booth for CBS Give me some info and nuggets I can use on the broadcast, John.
The Ravens offense is clearly clicking as Lamar Jackson trends towards his third MVP at only 27 years old. Another 5 touchdowns against the Bucs on Monday night, including Rashad Bateman, who got there with 2 40-yard catches and now has at least 4 receptions in 3 consecutive games. I'm not too worried about Zay Flowers. It seemed like he rolled his ankle in the first quarter, but he still remained out there, just clearly inefficient after he had that big 10-yard catch and 19-yard run in the first quarter. I still think he's going to be key and be playing every single snap. You can start him in fantasy. Where the Ravens will ultimately win this game is once again on the ground, because although the Browns aren't leaking, I would say, like, ceiling performances to opposing running games, they're not, like, giving it up heavily in terms of you can just look at the box score and say, okay, the Browns are a weak run defense. They're still allowing the 5th highest rate of explosive runs. And we know that Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson will put you in a blender if you allow them to play their RPO game and just get after you on the ground and don't even have to have Lamar drop back. So I think it's going to be a very successful day for both Henry and Lamar on the ground. And what makes this one so much fun, Ross, is that on the other side of the ball for the Browns, we now have Jameis Winston officially under center. And we've talked about this on every show, how the Ravens secondary is how you attack them. Even on Monday night, Rachaad White looks great in the box score with the 2 receiving touchdowns. But once again, no player, Josh Allen and Jaden Daniels included, have reached 50 rushing yards on the Ravens at all this year. You cannot run on them. So it has to go through the air. And if you let Jameis Winston go through the air, you know that the results that could be bad, could be good, but it's going to be fun. And so I think we're going to finally get a downfield game that can exploit this Ravens secondary. And if that's the case, my favorite options are obviously David Njoku, popped up for 14 targets in Cleveland's first game without Amari Cooper last week, but also the second-year wide receiver Cedric Tillman. Remember, Cedric Tillman overlapped with Jalen Hyatt, who got drafted by the Giants. They actually got drafted back-to-back last year. And Tillman was the one who, in the SEC, at 21 years old, had 1,000 yards and 12 receiving scores. He really hasn't had an opportunity just yet to play into an every-down role, but was second behind Jerry Jeudy in routes run last week, and Tillman's 12 targets, and more importantly, his 18 PPR points for fantasy, that's more than Jerry Jeudy's had since the 2022 season. I do think Tillman could actually outperform Jeudy the rest of the way as the better wide receiver to have for fantasy. He's the one I'm excited to watch in this game.
Wow, that's interesting, because I did notice when Winston came in the game last week, he was looking at Jeudy, man. I mean, he threw it to Jeudy like 3 or 4 times on that drive. Good to know. Anything else on that one before we move on?
Nick Chubb, although a heroic performance, got in there with the box score. Again, it's just an impossible spot where you can't run on the Ravens. So although he came back and still had 11 carries for the team, maybe they try to get him there, get him going in this game just to add some physicality. It's just a really tough spot again where I know everyone wants to start him in fantasy. I do think he's closer to an RB3 though in this game.
What about the Titans and the Lions, John?
And the Titans now, no DeAndre Hopkins, shipped to the Chiefs. We'll talk about that in a bit in the fallout. But Calvin Ridley, we're at least seeing coming off a squeaky wheel game where Brian Callahan did mention wanting to get him involved more, and they did get him 9 targets. Now, those 9 targets came from Mason Rudolph, and they were ineffective because as we continue to swap out Will Levis going through a shoulder injury and Mason Rudolph, it just seems to be that it ultimately does not matter. Also, again, another game where the Lions' run defense continues to carry their own weight, and it's a very tough spot despite Tony Pollard being an every touch back. Pollard even left the game last week with an injury, but when he was out there and he only missed a couple of possessions, while he was out there, Julius Chestnut didn't handle a single touch behind him. It's all Tony Pollard. So although the Lions are a tough run defense, Pollard is still a top 24 running back in my eyes. The issue is the Titans will probably have to pass the ball here because we know the Lions offense is clicking on all cylinders right now. Jared Goff over the last month has completed 83.5% of his passes for 9 touchdowns and 1 interception. Not only that, but even if David Montgomery were out, because this is one where, given how much we respect the Titans secondary and how well they perform against the pass, even if David Montgomery were out with a knee injury he suffered this past game, then we've seen Jahmyr Gibbs make starts without Montgomery. Not only an explosive 19 touches this past week, but also going back to last year in whose 2 starts, 19 touches for 100 yards and a touchdown and 31 touches for 180 yards and a touchdown. So if Montgomery's out, we know Gibbs just slides right in there against a front seven we want to attack. So definitely look for Gibbs to be maybe even a top 3 running back overall, depending on Montgomery's status.
Colts, Texans. I don't know what to do about Anthony Richardson and the Colts, John.
It's been tough, I know. Anthony Richardson began hot with double-digit fantasy points, but since that time, single-digit fantasy points in every start. We are keeping the light on, if only because he had 14 carries last week, so at least he got back involved. Still needs to learn how to slide. But right now what's really happening is that the entire passing game is being dragged down. Like, Michael Pittman continues to offer a floor for everyone. You can start him. And the issue is Josh Downs pops up in target share. He's earning the targets as a great slot receiver, but the targets are inefficient from Anthony Richardson as he continues to carry this NFL low 48% completion rate. It's been very bad as he continues to develop. Not only that, but the Texans front seven is one that gets after you, creating the 3rd highest pressure rate in the league, and Anthony Richardson has really struggled against pressure this year. So for me, the buck stops at Richardson, Michael Pittman, and Jonathan Taylor back in this game. On the other side of the ball, too, you would think that when you hear a game with Anthony Richardson, C.J. Stroud, that it could be an explosive one for fantasy. But we've seen a signal in games that Joe Mixon has played. And Mixon himself has been awesome. At least 26 fantasy points in all 3 games he's finished this year. The Colts defense is one we want to attack, in particular with our running backs. But also what's happening with offensive coordinator Bobby Slowick is that the Texans are calling the second highest run plate in the league in the games that Mixon has played. And because of that, especially because they're running the ball on 1st and 2nd down, they are actually ending up with the 3rd longest yards to go, 3rd longest distance on 3rd down. And so that's creating tough situations for C.J. Stroud because C.J. Stroud can get you out of anything. He's that good. But when you're asking him to constantly move the chains on 3rd and 8 and 3rd and 9, it's like the Packers. They knew it was coming because it's a long 3rd down and distance. So that's how they pressured C.J. Stroud on over half of his dropbacks, because then you're just letting the defense know what you have to do on offense. So I think the Texans have some kinks to work out for sure and how they scheme their game plan. But we at least know Joe Mixon will get there, and C.J. Stroud, we're still comfortable as a low-end QB1, although he's had just 2 top 12 performances for fantasy this year.
I'm looking forward to that one. What about the Packers and the Jags?
Normally a situation where, as I've said on every show this year, we want to attack the Jaguars secondary with an opposing quarterback. Even in London, despite getting blown out, Drake May was the QB4 on the week against Jacksonville. But there is a bit of a tell here that for whatever reason, Jordan Love has really struggled against man coverage for his entire career. Go back to last year, 34th with 6 yards per attempt among all quarterbacks against man coverage. This year he's dead last in the league, 3.9 yards per attempt. And we know Press Taylor and the Jaguars run the highest rate of man coverage in the league on over 40% of their snaps. If that's the case, where they're at least getting beat consistently is from the slot. The most fantasy points per game allowed to opposing slot receivers by the Jaguars, and that's where Jaden Reed continues to run. It's also why it's tricky from Jordan Love. It's not only that we may have a signal that he could struggle in this game, but also that with all 4 wide receivers healthy, Dontavian Wicks and Christian Watson included, they're all cannibalizing one another. Romeo Doubs continues running the most routes among all their receivers, and he's had a 2-touchdown game a couple weeks ago, 10 catches, 94 yards this past week, and so he continues to be the one with the highest floor. Beyond that, though, Wicks has been targeted on the highest rate of his routes, so he's someone to still consider as a flex option if you're desperate. Christian Watson leads them in end zone targets because they use him in particular as the big-bodied guy whenever they're in the red zone. And then Jaden Reed is very explosive, as we know, but he still mixes in on 3 wide receiver sets and struggles to get in there whenever they only have 2 wide receivers out there. So it's a conundrum for fantasy, but I still think you continue starting Reed and Dobbs in particular and mixing in Watson and Wicks into your flex. Also, The Jaguars are going to have to get by in this game, continuing to run the ball effectively. We saw Tank Bigsby look like one of the best running backs in the entire league last week. It seems like another game where Travis Etienne could miss time. And if so, we're looking at probably another 100-yard performance, a touchdown here for Tank Bigsby, as long as Jacksonville continues to hang around. I would love to tell you more information, what to do with Christian Kirk. Kirk also someone who's being floated at ahead of the trade deadline right now and continues to get lapped by Brian Thomas in terms of production for fantasy, but it really just comes down to game script. So if you think Jordan Love is going to have an immense successful day through the air, then yes, you can throw out Christian Kirk for a negative game script. Otherwise, it seems to be the two targets preferred by Lawrence right now are Evan Ingram, who came back a couple weeks ago, 10 targets this past week, and then Brian Thomas over Christian Kirk for the rest of the season.
Hey, Doug Peterson, here's my advice presented by Labatt Blue Light. Hand it to Bigsby, throw it to Brian Thomas. Okay, I've watched a bunch of your games. Those are your guys. And then drink some Labatt Blue Lights with your friends and live life to the power of we. Always enjoy it responsibly, Doug. Beer, Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. Okay, let's get to the Cardinals and the Dolphins now because we got news in this one. It looks like we're going to be getting Tua Tagovailoa back here, John.
And that's great for everyone who has all the Dolphins they've been waiting to explode. Tyreek Hill, season opener, over 130 receiving yards and a touchdown, has not gone over 70 receiving yards since. Jalen Waddle had over 100 receiving yards, has not gone over 50 yards since. Devon Achane, 7 catches in the first 2 games that Tua played and has really struggled since then around the injury. Not only that, but we now have 2 games this year, including last week against the Colts, where both Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane were able to finish. And in those games, it's Achane who outtouched Mostert 34-19. Mostert still hanging around as the running back they trust inside the 5-yard line. So especially against the Cardinals defense, it's one where, assuming Tua's back under center, we can finally jam every Dolphin back to our lineups, as they will likely be one of the more explosive offenses in the NFL as long as he's back there. For the Cardinals, it's a little tricky because another performance now where Marvin Harrison Jr. doesn't live up to the hype of the second-round pick you used on him earlier this offseason for fantasy football. Jonathan Gannon, head coach, came out after the game and mentioned that the Chargers had double-teamed Marvin Harrison on a majority of his snaps, and that's why he struggled here. But the Dolphins' secondary has also been very good this year in limiting opposing wide receiver ones. So I do worry that maybe it's another bracket or double situation where Harrison struggles to get there. I believe he should be ranked as a wide receiver 24, wide receiver 2, or fringe wide receiver 2 the rest of the season until this Cardinals offense really figures it out. Because what they're doing truly under offensive coordinator Drew Petzing is leaning on James Conner as the engine of their offense. We saw it on Monday night as well, as he continues to bulldoze his way to effective and high ceiling performances in fantasy. So I still believe James Conner is an RB1 in this matchup, and Marvin Harrison Jr., like I mentioned, more of a cross-your-fingers option.
Absolutely no I in football, and Smirnoff knows that. It's a we thing. We experience it together. Tailgates, watching at a friend's house. Smirnoff's the world's #1 vodka, official vodka partner in the NFL, and they're giving fans in select areas of the country a chance to win the ultimate game day experience, from tickets to sideline passes and so much more. Just head to WeDoGameDays.com until November 15th to enter for your chance to win. Smirnoff, We Do Game Days. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff number 21 vodka, distilled from grain, 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company, New York, New York. Please do not share with anyone under legal drinking age. No purchase necessary. 21 plus. Ends 11/15/24. See rules at website for participating area and other important details. Sponsored by Diageo Americas Incorporated, New York, New York. Absolutely love James Conner right now. All right, what about the Jets and the Patriots?
Patriots, I think Drake May will go overlooked because usually when we hear the Jets talked about it is about their menacing defense. But now we've seen that they have leaked back-to-back performances. And I don't know if this is, we've seen this in the past where people who are usually very good at coordinating on one side of the ball, defense or offense, become head coach, and then it turns out they end up taking on too much. And I don't know if that's what's happening with Jeff Ulbrich or not, but so far the last 2 weeks, they have played Josh Allen and Russell Wilson, and those two players finished as top 5 quarterbacks for fantasy. Not only that, but we're also seeing the Jets defense in particular get hammered over the middle of the field to tight ends the last 2 weeks as well, since Ulbrich was named interim head coach. 763-1, and then last week, 6 catches for 87 yards to tight end rooms. So from Drake May, who now has 2 career starts and has been a top 12 quarterback for fantasy in both of those starts, and Hunter Henry, who seems to be one of his preferred options, 11 catches the last 2 weeks from May. I think those are 2 guys that we can still trust in this game, regardless of how much we respect the Jets' defense. On the other side of the ball, too, 9 targets for Davante Adams in his debut, and still was second on the team among their wide receivers in routes run. Really just got right out there, and there were definitely some issues where Adams and Rodgers hadn't played football in a couple years together. You could see the timing was off. I would imagine it gets itself fixed. Allen Lazard was the real loser there in terms of fantasy and ceding targets as we expected to Adams and Wilson. So Lazard's the one we can no longer trust. I will say, though, for Breece Hall, it is a really good situation. It's not just that the last 2 games that under Ulbrich, Hall has now out-touched Braylon Allen 41-6. But it's also that the Patriots defense, although Gerard Mayo inexplicably called them soft, what's happening is that the defense is just under Mayo's play calling, by the way, is just falling to pieces. And right now in particular, they're getting destroyed by opposing running games, including in London. We saw Tank Bigsby, 118 and 2 touchdowns. Before him, Joe Mixon, 102 yards and 2 touchdowns if you include his receiving score. And then remember, in that game against Houston, Dameon Pierce even went for 76 yards and a rushing touchdown. So it seems like a blow-up game for Breece Hall, and one that the Jets can finally score a confident 20 points in.
Yeah, I mean, he looked awesome Sunday night against the Steelers. It feels like, John, anecdotally, that Rodgers is at his best when he's throwing to Lazard, to be honest with you. I think you almost should throw it to Lazard more, just having done that game Sunday night. What about the Falcons and the Bucks?
And this is a review, remember, because the last time these 2 teams played, Kirk Cousins threw for 500 yards on prime time. I don't think it'll be exactly like that, especially since we have so many changes to discuss. And so that's why I want to start with the Bucs side of the ball, because Baker, in that last game against Raheem Morris, 19 of 24, 3 touchdowns. Mike Evans also 6 catches for 62 yards and 2 touchdowns, as the Falcons, although they haven't leaked really big performance to opposing quarterbacks, they'll give it up to wide receiver ones. Your top wide receiver can absolutely get there weekly against them, including DK Metcalf, who had his 99 yards and a touchdown all in the first half before he got injured last week. And in this particular game, I think the player people want to pick up for fantasy and who I can believe will be their wide receiver 1 without Mike Evans, who's now out at least through the team's Week 11 bye with a hamstring injury, and unfortunately Chris Godwin dislocated his ankle, air cast, out for the season. I think the player who steps in is their exciting rookie, Jalen McMillan. It began in the preseason when McMillan was targeted on 37.5% of his routes for 3.5 yards per route run. And then, remember, Jalen McMillan played with the Washington Huskies and Michael Penix, and in his last 2 years in college, ran 91% of his routes from the slot, where Chris Godwin has been dominating for a team-high percentage of his route. Also, go back to 2022, because in his final year in college in 2023, McMillan suffered an MCL sprain, and he re-aggravated it multiple times, so we really try to throw that one away. But in 2022, McMillan out-targeted Rome Odunze 21% to 19.5% from Penix as well. He also stepped in off the bench, 8 targets on Monday night, so I think he's the player we should be excited about for fantasy. Trey Palmer last year drafted among his class and being targeted and on his routes, but he's also someone who's really struggled to be accustomed to the NFL so far. So I think in place, like I mentioned, of Godwin and Evans, it is McMillan, the one to be high on. Also, Cade Otton, of course, who is out there for a route practically on every single snap. We saw him pop up for 100 yards. He hasn't dipped below a double-digit target share in any game since week 3 as well. Not to mention the Bucs backfield. I know we got excited about Sean Tucker, who looked great, but as we expected, he was the third fiddle behind Rachaad White, who came right back in to that receiving role that he's always done well in. 70 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns from Baker, and Bucky Irvin, the RB2 there. So Tucker is still someone that we can stash in 14-team leagues, but no standalone value as long as White and Bucky Irving are healthy. On the other side of the ball, too, last year, the Bucs, remember, were very elite against the run, and that's why they were forcing teams to pass it against them. This year, they give it up wherever you want to take it. And I think it could be a great game for Bijan Robinson, because as this Bucs team has struggled, top 5 in yards per carry allowed, we finally saw Bijan look extremely healthy against the Seahawks. His first game to handle 80% of the running back touches since week 1. Not only that, but because the team has already said they're riding the hot hand, that's who they had leaned on well over Tyler Algier, who only had 5 carries in that game. So Bijan Robinson, someone to absolutely trust now in this spot.
Love it. Absolutely love it. We got a whole other show to go. Don't go anywhere. I think we're done here.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcasts on your favorite platform.